This is a production of Cornell University.
And we just heard this morning from Rich Buckley, and we had heard it before, but John Inguigiato is at University of Connecticut, turfgrass pathologist, has now seemed to have stumbled into a new pathogen that might be a problem, and also take-all patches starting to rear its ugly head. So we've got some insects and diseases we can talk about. But for this week, our fastest 30 minutes in turf begins with a lovely first green, a 3-day first green outing out at Old Erie Golf Club with Matt Woodcock, the golf course superintendent out there. This has been such a lovely initiative through the GCSAA, started by Jeff Gullickson out in Western Washington. Jeff and I did a podcast a while ago on Frankly Speaking. He is the original founder of this. Like 25, 30 years ago, he was doing this. So it took a while for it to catch on with the GCSAA, but now that it has, it's actually gone international. They're doing these first greens in Europe, and they're doing them in Australia. So a great way of promoting the multifunctional landscapes that golf courses are. And just love bringing the kids. Jesse Shaver, somebody I used to know many years ago out in the Michigan, at Gull Lake View, Michigan. This is a privately owned golf course by that family. And this is his boys getting up 4:30 in the morning, no problem getting out there working. And Carl, wouldn't be a day with me without the dogs. And of course, just all the help and just the majesty that our dogs can be sometimes. But I have to start to set you up, Carl. I just got my 15 minutes of fame last week or a couple of weeks ago when the episode that I filmed with Martha Stewart came on, and in that episode that you can find on Roku by scanning this thing, so I can keep my 15 minutes going and maybe do some good by getting people to focus on the soil. If you watch the clip, you'll see I say, it starts with the soil, and I dug a hole in her front lawn, my claim to fame, and I said she's got good roots. So, Carl, I know you got something to say about soil, so I'm really interested to hear it.
Yeah, the idea of soil testing, right, Frank? And we hear all the time from a lot of our extension folks here in New York, how homeowners come to them and they view soil testing, specifically soil chemical testing, right? Things like potassium, phosphorus, pH, all the other, micronutrients, that it'll be the sort of the diagnostic tool that will illuminate all of their problems in their lawn, right? My lawn looks bad. Oh, my soil test is going to be the diagnostic that tells me what's wrong and sort of charts my path forward. And there are all these YouTube videos you can find, right? Why your lawn sucks. Let's fix it. 150,000 views. People look at soil testing, right? So I sort of want to start with where we're at, what data we look at when we look at a soil test, and specifically how we interpret it, right? So you take your soil test. We're not going to talk about how you do it. It's pretty simple, right? You stick a probe in the ground 15 times, put it in a bag, ship it off. They give you these numbers back, usually parts per million. Sometimes they list it in parts, pounds per acre or something. But you got to interpret that, right? What do those numbers mean? And what we'd say now, the data we'd look at for that is the minimum levels of sustainable nutrition guidelines, MLSN for short. And this is a newer method that was established probably around 10 years ago now by Micah Woods and the folks at Pace Turf. So they looked at actual data from turfgrass samples, and they figured out the minimum level that if you're above that level of nutrient concentration in your soil, we can have a high confidence that your soil will have all it needs to function, right? So in this example, potassium concentrations, if you're above 37 parts per million, we think there's all the potassium that grass needs to function if you are at more than 37 parts per million. And that's a departure from some of the older methods, right, Frank, which were, low, optimum, high, right? And then very few would be in the optimum range. Well, I got to get this one low. I got to get this one high. And that sort of came from, crop production, where you're trying to maximize yield, and you probably need to be really specific about nutrient availability if I want to make, $2 more per acre.
Yeah. And in the old days, Carl, when they said low, medium, and high, what that meant was if you had a low test level, that meant you had a 75% chance of getting a response from a fertilizer application. Medium was a 50%, and high was a 25%. So even when you were low, there was a 25% chance by adding fertilizer, it wasn't going to do anything, right? And so these are perfect things for selling fertilizer. And I do think it's important. These numbers have come real down, but I got to tell you, Carl, it's been out for 10 years. Not everybody agrees. So what about what we've learned in our work here?
Yeah, so you're exactly right, Frank, right? The idea that there might be a response, we sort of look at those numbers and say, man, they're a lot lower than an older system like, you can see on the screen is SLAN, the SLAN approach. They said, hey, you need 110 parts per million. So a couple of years ago at Sunken Meadow, we had Helena help us out. They did a bunch of soil testing on all the fairways at Sunken Meadow State Park Golf Course, 27 fairways or 27 holes. And on every fairway, we took the data back and we interpreted it using the SLAN approach and also the MLSN approach and figured out, okay, how much fertilizer is it going to recommend between those two? And this is just one fairway, a good example for the whole course, right? This fairway for the SLAN approach, it says, hey, we need 560 pounds of potassium. MLSN says you don't need any, right? And now if you're thinking as a turf manager or maybe as a homeowner who wants a high quality lawn, well, if I don't apply to fertilizer, is it still going to look good? Am I still going to have turf grass quality that's acceptable? And now we're starting to get some research here from the folks at Michigan State, Jackie Guevara and Kevin Frank, that's given us some answers to this, right? So they did manage a couple of lawn areas with the SLAN approach, MLSN. The SLAN approach applied 4 times more phosphorus, 4.5 times more potassium than the MLSN approach. And over 2 years, they found no differences in the color or the quality of those areas between those two approaches, right? So that tells me a couple things, Frank. One, if I'm going to get the same exact result from these two things, I might as well apply less fertilizer because it's going to cost me a lot less. That also means less phosphorus, which can get into our waterways and cause eutrophication and water quality concerns. I like those two things. The other thing it sort of tells me is, man, it's probably not super important fertilizing with things like potassium or phosphorus or magnesium or calcium outside of maybe some niche situations, especially in the Northeast where we have, these clay-based native soils that hold a lot of nutrients. There's probably a lot of other things that matter, most notably nitrogen, right? So when I show these MLSN values, we don't have anything for nitrogen, right? That's almost always the limiting nutrient. That's going to be the thing that guides your turf grass quality or density or color much more so than these other nutrients. Which brings me to sort of my hypothetical question. I guess the question to you, Frank, it's more of a larger picture existential question, but should we even soil test? We look at data from the GCSAA does a national survey. They ask a bunch of superintendents across the country, do you soil test? And then they ask them, how much fertilizer do you use? And what we've seen in recent years is people that soil test use more fertilizer than people who don't soil test. And that's probably a function of the interpretation, like you say, Frank. This MLSN stuff's been around for 10 years, but not everybody's heard of it. People are still, predominantly probably using those older methods that are suggesting you apply a lot of fertilizer. And so are we sort of wasting fertilizer? Are we not being as efficient as we could? That's one question. The other question is, sometimes even when we use MLSN, the results are sort of contradictory to what we might see in the field. So very often we go on our state park golf courses, we soil test a green. The green looks great, right? Go on Bethpage State Park, the black course, those are greens that host the PGA Championship. You could host it right now, probably. And it may say, so those greens are great greens. That's the result. That might be like Scotty Scheffler hitting this shot directly down the middle of the fairway. But the soil test says, we're a little bit low in phosphorus or a little bit low in potassium. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, right? The result is really good. It's very high quality. And if you look at Scotty Scheffler, right, the analogy is, he's got arms and legs flying all over the place when he's hitting the ball, when he, in his follow through, he's practically falling over, but the ball is going straight, right? So this is sort of, I think, where the expertise and the turfgrass manager comes into play, and they can look at those soil test results and say, my result is pretty good right now. I know maybe MLSN or SLAN is telling me to fertilize, but I don't see any deficiencies. My grass looks really good. Maybe I'll use that data as sort of my own site-specific MLSN, right? If my turf's performing good with 15 parts per million phosphorus, all right, that's fine. And then maybe later on when it's not performing so good, I take a soil test and it says 7, and I see some evidence that maybe it's not growing the right way. Maybe that's when I choose to fertilize with phosphorus, right? So I think thinking about this, using the MLSN is the good starting point,
Yep.
I think. And then sort of using that expertise, right, Frank, I think is something we should.
Well, and Carl, now with Jackie and Kevin's work, we got data. This isn't a mystery. And we're not saying, here's the thing I think is important. I don't think anyone's saying, if you think you've got a visual deficiency, or if when you put nitrogen on, you don't feel like you're getting a full response when you should. Yep. Those are indications that you might have one of those situations where you might need to balance up some of these, bring up some of these other nutrients. But as I've said before, sarcastically, this is a spectacular tool for selling fertilizer because there's no downside. You're never going to hurt your turf. Now, what I would say is you certainly make your soil lazy. When you're supplying all these nutrients, there's no real need for the plant to have to then go scavenge nutrients. And we've learned in situations where they do have low nutrient levels, and of course, Dr. Soldat at Wisconsin said this as well, the plant gets it out of mineral stuff in the top dressing sand. So I think what I like to think about is, you think we're not doing any harm, but we're also not sort of training our soils to be more sustainable by supplying those nutrients. And it's the same sort of thing why we don't need mycorrhizae. A lot of people say, oh, put mycorrhizae and you'll help your nutrient absorption. Hello, we got too many nutrients. And in those cases, mycorrhizae development is suppressed. You don't get mycorrhizae when you don't need them, when you're bathed in phosphorus. So I think this is an important thing to consider. And so what I wanted to do, Carl, before I get to the weather, is pick up on some of the things that substantiate in history, why we don't have to worry about a lot of these nutrients. And I think we're sort of two minds. I don't want you to soil test because it distracts you from what potential real problems might be, but I do want you to soil test just to get it out of the way. All right, it looks good. Put it to the side. It's not something you've got to worry about. So back right around the American Civil War in 1856, some early mineral fertilizer manufacturers in England started a trial in Rothamsted called the Park Grass experiment, that they applied various amounts of NP, K, calcium, sulfur, magnesium, and had different pH treatments. So, again, it's not a turf grass situation. It's a pasture situation. And there's some plots on the side that they've added over the years, but essentially it gets cut 3 times a year. And they've been imposing these treatments for 170 years. So we have a fair amount of data. Now, what's really interesting is pretty much after 35 years, not much has changed. So they could have stopped this experiment about 100 years ago, but have kept it going. And what they find is, here's some interesting things. They've had plots they've applied only ammonium sulfate to for 188 years. And that plot is entirely grass. Now, it's a Agrostis bentgrass species. So I'm not sure if you want that on your lawn, that's what you want to do. Bentgrass tends to be a problem for us here. But if you're a golf course superintendent, you ought to be hearing this saying, okay, I'm pretty good now. I'm sort of liking this. Can acidify and be an Agrostis dominated situation. Any plot they applied potassium or calcium to on a regular basis had way more dandelions. And so I don't know how you necessarily lower some of these nutrients other than to take them off, but the place to start is to stop applying them. And fortunately, many, many products now have very low P, well, almost 0 P, and very low K in the lawn space. I still see golf guys pretty determined, and if you're growing annual bluegrass, I would certainly support the regular use of potassium for what we know about managing moisture and winter damage. But Carl, I wanted to highlight the work you led and we did with the Upper Susquehanna Chemung Watershed, this sort of voluntary program that I think really codifies our thinking on the matter, right? This idea that you don't need a lot of nitrogen, you shouldn't need much supplemental nutrients. It's very much based on your soil. If you got sand, you need a little bit more. You got native soil, you need a little bit less. You got traffic, you need a little bit more. You don't have traffic, you need a little bit less. Very focused, very simple, straightforward. But if you get paid to apply fertilizer, you're not going to like any of this conversation, right? I mean, a lot of our lawn care operators are in a bit, I mean, how do I make money if I don't apply fertilizer? Well, this remains a conundrum for that area. But it brings up the question about soil health, right? You hear people talk about it. Is it a healthy soil? How do you know? So we've got the soil health test that you can perform, and Carl and I have done this on a bunch of our soils. I'm not entirely sure what it tells us because it wasn't designed for growing grass like we do. It was designed for production agriculture. We could probably set some boundaries, like use the MLSN for chemical testing, use bulk density for physical testing. But the biological testing certainly still remains a little bit specious. And I think what we've learned, Carl, is organic matter is a good proxy. So we hear a lot about managing chemical things, but I want to talk about managing physical properties. And the first thing is, what doesn't work? Well, what doesn't work are these drum aerifiers that, after 2 times a year over 5 years, studies have shown these drum roller aerifiers don't do anything to alleviating compaction. If you want to bring up soil and seed a lawn or something, this is a good tool. But as I said to Martha, not very much with this thing, right? And I don't think the regular application of compost is also should be routine. I don't think coring and composting should be routine. And as I said to Martha, this thing is a complete waste of time and carbon emissions. I mean, you're not really doing anything when you bring up this material. This stuff's just going to degrade anyway. It's mostly just clippings that are ultimately going to make their way back down into the soil. So while we talk a lot about physical property management, I'm not a big fan of either of these tools. I feel like, especially in golf, we manage organic matter in the dark. We verticut. We love this business, poking holes and doing this stuff, when what we should be doing is using a data-driven approach to managing organic matter. And I think this is the kind of soil testing that's going to replace chemical soil testing moving forward. And I think, as we've talked about this, Carl, there's a real correlation between the amount of nitrogen you use, the traffic you impose, and the organic matter that you create. Now, that thatchy material at the top is what really sort of screws it up. You need some, but you don't want too much. And of course, we've learned with Joe Lucas at Saratoga National that where he's got heavy traffic, he has a much more uniform mat layer with the organic matter mixed in there, and the low traffic approach where growth is happening, that's really unnecessary. I'd call it gratuitous growth. You don't have that much traffic. And you know what I've started to see on golf courses everywhere I travel? Firm greens, firm fairways, spongy approaches. What the hell? And it's because we started babying these things. We're giving them greens fertilizers. We're putting hand walkers on them. Don't put them. Screw that. Get the heavy mowers on them. Get the roller on them. The more, or drop your nitrogen rate. Don't put it on a putting green program. Most people are just walking over that thing. There's very little traffic that occurs on these things. And I think approaches, what we learned during COVID was that if you brought the heavy mower up from the fairway up to the green, you had a good operator that knew how to maneuver, you could really work to reduce some of this problem. So, Carl, I want to get through the weather, but I want to see any comments on my organic matter discussion here.
Yeah, I think, you mentioned soil health there, and definitely what we found is there's a pretty good linear correlation between soil health tests. Generally, that's measuring like respiration, biological activity, and organic matter. I mean, we did almost 40 samples on the fairways here at Cornell, and the samples that had high soil health scores, I mean, they rate them 0 to 100, a lot of 100s. They had high organic matter. And that's the nice part about grass, is it generates a lot of organic matter, and that's food for all that biological activity. So bringing it back to organic matter, I think, is how everything starts, and probably where we should start when we think about measuring soil characteristics.
Right. Yeah. Once you build that organic matter, you got more traffic tolerance. Yep. You've got nutrients. You've got water holding. You've got everything a soil needs right, without adding a lot of fine particulate matter in a clay, right? You get cation exchange capacity from organic matter, right? You get some traffic tolerance and resilience from that organic matter. But what you don't want is this excessive amount that sits at the surface and screws around with the things that you're doing. All right, let me get to the lawn. Let me get to the weather stuff, Carl, because I got a couple of model questions for you.
Yeah.
Soils are warming up, right? If you haven't made your summer patch drench or your fairy ring drench where you've got these problems, grasses are growing in earnest. And one of the things, as we've talked about before, once this mass warms up, and if you're out in Western New York, Old Buffalo, and up along the, the Thruway corridor, Rochester, all the way over to Syracuse, you got soils in the 70s up there that are some of the warmest in the state. It's been it was a fairly dry week, except they got a big dump on the east end of Long Island. I bet you our brothers out in Martha's Vineyard got a little bit of that, and Vicki Wallace and other people on Eastern Connecticut and Rhode Island got a ton of rainfall. And so, Carl, here's my question, right? We've got this heat. We've got these models. So let me show you, and then we'll chat. So here's the dollar spot risk models, the way it was this past week and what we're expecting. And you can see the forecast indicates a substantial decline in the next few days. You look at the maps. You have the 23rd where everything's lit up red, and then 5 days later you're moving into the green. You also see with brown patch, another disease driven by prolonged periods of leaf wetness, right? Humidity, high temperature. Brown patch kicks in when dollar spot's not, it's a little too warm for dollar spot. Rich Buckley said he saw a brown patch on colonial bent grass, but he hasn't seen any dollar spot out there. So here's my question, Carl. What do you do? What if your fungicide application is due in a day or two or in 3 days? Are you going out today? Are you planning to spray like many do on Monday? How do you approach making a decision looking at this data?
Yeah. So the first thing I look is the general slope, right? If you look at that green line, the 7-day trend is going down. It's going from the high risk to moderate and even down to low risk. So, let's say most golf course superintendents, spray on a Monday. That's pretty typical. I'm looking at that Monday time frame, right? 27th-ish, 28th-ish. And I'm probably thinking, hey, going into Saturday, Sunday, I'm probably going to plan not to put down an application. If I'm thinking about fairways, right? Where maybe I've only planned for, let's say, 5 for the year. Gosh, am I going to make 2 in May? Let's say I made one last week. That would be on the low probability side, right? Normally, if we look at this data, we really don't get into that high dollar spot consistently until June, maybe early mid-June.
So you're thinking this is an anomaly, this early May is an anomaly, certainly different than last year.
Yes.
But then you've also got this particular issue as well. When you look at where the red is coming down from Rochester, almost down to where we are here, and there's smatterings of it. It's very interesting. It just popped, and now it looks like it's flattening out. So again, we got a pretty good forecast today that maybe we're going to be cooler, and it seems like that's going to slow the dollar spot progression. So you're saying maybe wait till Monday for your large area applications. I mean, nobody's going to hold off on greens, that's for sure.
No, right.
But we're really talking about that 25, 30 acre application that you're going to make, if you're going to make it for fairways. Your suggestion is to hold.
Yeah, this would be a case where I think, especially that brown patch, is just a quick blip and then it goes away. And again, if I've paid attention to these and when I pay attention out in our turf plots, I would say, yeah, this is sort of a blip, and that cool off period is probably we're probably not going to see a whole lot of disease outbreak. I would also look at the Smith-Kearns model, and that's probably saying the same thing right now. We're probably on the downward trend of disease risk. So I would probably hold off, to be honest.
Okay. All right. Well, it was warm last week inland and cool along the coast, and you saw that in the soils as well. The soils really responded to this, and this is very typical typical of what we see on a growing degree day basis. You can see from last year, the coast again is much cooler than normal, inland much warmer than normal. So we're right around within a week of normal, but along the coast is a little bit slower. And I think those wet areas are things you got to watch out for also. Looks like it's going to be a cooler than normal and near normal precip, although what I think Art was saying is we're going to get rain, maybe not a lot, but it's going to be pretty consistently risk of rain for the next week. So I think, again, it doesn't look like disease models are blowing up. But the heat we just got made me think about herbicide use, right? And we have these models for weed control, the amine and ester model for dandelion control. And you see that the amine still has, some red areas where it won't work, where the ester still works. But one of the things you got to worry about with the ester formulation that will work more effectively is that it can volatilize. When you get temperatures in excess of 80, 85 degrees, and you put these volatile phenoxy-based herbicides, 2,4-D, dicamba, MCPP, a lot of these materials are volatile. They'll get airborne, they'll get some vapor drift, and you'll see what we call epinastic growth, this curling of the leaf tissue, very common in the urban landscape at this time of year when weed control is rampant, particularly broadleaf weed control is rampant. And just another note about weeds, stilt grass is up and it comes up early. We're starting to see more goosegrass. One of the things that we know is a lot of our products like pendimethalin and dithiopyr don't do very well on goosegrass. And we're facing some oxadiazone, Ronstar restrictions moving forward. So these particular weeds make me a little bit nervous. Stilt grass, and I'm more worried about nutsedge now. Are we ever going to be able to control this weed? Typically, I would start recommending those applications for nutsedge start now and make 2 or 3 of them before the middle of June. So, Carl, that's what I got. We had no problem filling the show today. Are there questions that we should get to before we wrap it up?
Yeah, there's a really good comment by Ben Palmer who said, I'd like to do MSN, but it's difficult to find only nitrogen fertilizer, right? A bag of nitrogen fertilizer, especially granular, right? It's hard to find just N, no P, no K, no anything else. And, for homeowners, that's basically impossible. You can't go into a store and find a granular that's nitrogen only, right? And that's a limiting factor, right? If you just want to apply
but I think thankfully there's no P, and I think you'd be hard pressed to find a K level in most lawn fertilizers in excess of 5 to 7.
Yeah.
They're getting pretty smart about that. And at the commercial end, Ben, I tell you, there's no excuses at that end. In my opinion, commercial guys should be able to get pretty much whatever they want. I mean, even if you've got to melt urea, right, urea at 4600, you can melt that stuff. So ammonium sulfate, we buy here at Cornell. We've been buying it for years as one of those herbicide additives. I think we buy it locally just from them. But I do think it is an issue that maybe you can't get the material exactly the way you want it. But I think the other problem homeowners have, a lot of consumers have is, and maybe it's true for a lot of commercial people with who they work with, you can't get it without an herbicide in the spring. Mm-hmm. I don't want to weed and feed. I got to separate those things. I don't want those things in the same bag. So I do think it presents a little bit of a challenge, but I don't think it's insurmountable. And if you're having a hard time getting something that is nitrogen only, I would say, let's find another distributor. And I don't sweat 3% K, 5% K. But when I go visit a golf course superintendent or a sports field manager, and he's got 110 part per million potassium, and he's throwing 0060 in a spray tank or 0060 in a spreader, my head wants to explode. And they're like, you can't talk them off of it. Now I'm having a hard time talking guys off of silica. They're into silica. Okay. We got to put silica out there, make that turf rigid. I don't know what's happened, but the fertilizer industry's gotten really good at obfuscating what absolutely isn't needed. The truth is if you can figure out how to get a little bit of K, a little bit of nitrogen, manage that pH between 5.5 and 8.5. And if you get above 7, there's not much you can do to bring it down anyway. I think you're going to wind up being good. I think what we're talking about, Carl, to wrap it up today is don't get distracted. It's rarely a primary problem that you have a nutrient deficiency. The only time I really ever see it is in a new lawn that's been built on a subsoil, right? That they've taken the topsoil out and you haven't had grass on it.
Yep. Yeah. I think that's a good way to end today. That's a whole show that was a rant, essentially.
A rant about soils.
I think the audience will like that.
All right.
But yeah, we'll plan to do one more next week for everybody.
We'll see you next week.
Episode. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Carl. See you, everyone.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.